So this is a fireside chat with Arthur Breitman. Um, and I think I don't know how much of an intro Arthur needs, but I think maybe a lot of people in the DeFi space on the ETH side haven't met Arthur, maybe don't know exactly his background. But Arthur spent a bunch of time in finance before this, both on the market making side and trading side, and then started Tezos and has kind of been working on lots of associated projects and really building out the Tezos ecosystem. And I think he's probably, I think he and I have talked about designs of DeFi protocols before kind of they really blew up, and we've had a lot of discussions, some of which have led to designs that have really worked super well in practice, and other ones that maybe haven't. And so I think you guys are going to find out a lot of interesting and sort of in-depth mechanism related questions. We're going to try to be more technical, not so crazy, but more than I think a lot of the other earlier talks. So I think the first question is, right now, I think there are a lot of people who, especially investors who, are maybe not so familiar with DeFi, but they just say, hey, there's this shiny new object. It seems to be taking liquidity away from my existing investments, so I guess I need to look into what it is. And in some ways, there are a lot of similarities with centralized cryptocurrency and centralized financial entities. But, I think maybe let's step back and talk about what things in centralized finance look similar to DeFi, and sort of maybe why are yields, why do you think yields are so high right now?
Yeah, so you have to look, when you're looking at any space, you have to look what's kind of like internal and what's external. A lot of the DeFi right now kind of like serves itself. A lot of it is very circular. And if you look at what's available today, it looks a lot like not so much finance, but other companies, for example, like BitMEX or Bitfinex, which were centralized, and now you have some fully or partly decentralized version of this that you see on smart contract platforms. I remember back in 2013, friend of mine says like, hey, there's this thing in called Bitfinex, and you can lend money there, and there's like a 459% APR. And my reaction at the time is like, okay, there's something wrong. Either they're lying about this, or it's risk, and so on and so forth. I think risk is a component to it. I think the reason you see that these lending protocols have like this very high yield for lending is that there is definitely risk involved. But that wouldn't explain the volume. And so I think basically there's like tremendous demand for people who want to like use these things for leverage, and there's not a lot of supply because most institutions who would normally participate in traditional financial markets are not participating in this. And so you have an imbalance, but it's not something that's intrinsic to DeFi. It's not like, oh, DeFi is wonderful, look how big the yield are. If anything, it's just because it's out of equilibrium.
I mean, I think we've seen for a lot of the more successful, it took quite a while to reach equilibrium. I think with Compound, for instance, it took both a lot of markets coming online, plus the kind of invention of the C token, which made it a lot more easy for users to actually interact with these things, and the C token design has been copied and kind of throughout the ecosystem. Similarly, there's sort of a market equilibrium of things like Uniswap, where they start off deviating quite a bit from traditional markets or centralized prices, but they eventually converge to something meaningful. And in a lot of ways, Uniswap is sort of the most kind of amazing success story of sort of independent development, really being able to bootstrap a large liquidity pool by using a mechanism that was novel. So since you've been on the market making side in traditional finance, where a lot of people say that things like Uniswap and other constant function market makers are ineffective and costly, could you maybe walk us through why they're so successful, and kind of why they've found a niche that doesn't exist in the normal markets?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're ineffective. But coming from the market making side on traditional markets, it's extremely competitive, and in order for a market maker to be competitive in traditional markets, you have to be basically paying attention to every single bit of data. You have to be reacting to the market very, very quickly. But as a market maker, your profit is going to be a function of two things. It's like how reactive you are, how much information you have, and how much of the volume that you're getting is just people who want to trade in and out because they're rebalancing their portfolio or any other reasons, or people who are taking advantage of you because they're like, your price is slightly off and I'm going to benefit from that. And it's very much focused on that. And if you look at something like Uniswap, there's not a lot of intelligence in this market maker. It's like a purely supply. It's a supply-based algorithm, and these are known to market makers. The problem is that if you put on the market maker hat and you look at this, you're like, well, hang on a second. You're not going to be able to react to market moves. You can't move your quotes. There's a lot of things that you cannot do. But pretty much the reason for the success is that even though I think these are still valid criticisms, at the end of the day, there is just so much demand for it that sure, it's in theory it can be picked off and so on and so forth, but there's just too much demand for trading in and out of these different tokens that are on Uniswap that it basically it basically makes it worthwhile. And so it's been serving pretty well the tail end of all of these. All these different tokens, but I don't think it's a future in the sense like I don't think in the future you see all the financial assets on this supply-based market maker because I don't think they're competitive if you really are looking at very competitive markets with a lot of liquidity.
Yeah, I think while that's true, you could argue that you can add some aspects of limit order book structure to some of these supply-based systems by kind of bucketing liquidity in different ways and having it sort of like dynamically rebalanced. A little bit kind of like, I think Curve has really found amazing product market fit because every time I talk to OTC traders, including people from places that are very anti-DeFi, like the Jumps of the world, they started using Curve because it's just cheaper and they can trade in size. And part of that comes from the fact that they've been able to actually replicate the best parts of OTC mixed with an order book with proper curve design. And sort of there's this renaissance of actual mechanism design, I guess, unlike kind of what we saw in 2017, which was Ponzi scheme design. What do you think about that? Like, how big do you think the design space is? What do you think kind of the natural end state is? The Uniswaps of the world are sort of the original version. It's the first thing.
I would say if you look at a protocol that kind of takes the opposite route, which is more of like, let's look at what the academic literature tells us that a market clearing should be. You can look at what Gnosis is doing, for example, where they have the full batch auction with combinatorial bits. That's like the most generic form of the problem and trying to solve it that way. I tend to be very theory driven, and so I think if you're looking long term, the end result looks more like big batch combinatorial auction. But I also think that all of the I think a lot of centralized finance is frankly here to stay because for efficiency reasons, not everything needs to be decentralized. I think decentralization is important for lowering costs. It's important for censorship resistance, and so I think it will find its use. But for a lot of things, it's really, really hard to build a centralized order book.
Yeah. So while that's true, I do think that one of the things that people kind of didn't quite, I think, understand in the 2017 boom was Tezos was kind of one of the few layer ones that I would say that promised a lot of stuff at that time that actually like launched and has kind of made a lot of progress. But I think a lot of people kind of made these not kind of utilized layer ones layer one designs that didn't take into account some of the gas and computational constraints that something like a batch auction might have. You actually, if you think about it, if you wanted to make an optimized batch auction, you really have to, there's a lot of design choices you can make to make that much more efficient. You know, that's why for Gnosis's case, they really need this off-chain oracle to provide solutions to it. But let's move on to kind of what Tezos can do. What are sort of, you know, if we take what's in Ethereum, Ethereum's very capacity constrained, compute constrained. It's expensive to do things like batch auctions. What are things that Tezos is working on in terms of DeFi, and like how's the ecosystem growing, and kind of tell us about how that's different from Ethereum?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think there are a few key differences in this which are relevant to the topic, and one is a focus on formal verification of smart contracts. There's a lot of complexity involved in the DeFi contracts, and a lot of complexity means a lot of room for bugs. There's a lot of interaction between contracts, which is also a source of potential bugs. It's really hard to imagine how these contracts can interact with each other. There were a few contracts drained this way with like chains of like many calls and using flash loans. So it gets really hard to think about all the consequences, and you can look at this as like financial Lego. You can look at it as financial dominoes, and so I would say the emphasis on verification is useful. In terms of capacity, I think that it's something that has been increasing in Tezos. In the first protocol change, it was a doubling of the gas limit, and then there was a further increase by 30%. So it's something that keeps being refined. But I don't think that a goal of the project has been to chase a very high throughput on a main chain. I would say as a goal. I don't think it's bad to have that, but I think that what we've seen with Ethereum actually is that layer 2 solutions have been really good scaling solution, and I think that's a very promising area for doing all of these things. Another one is that Ethereum very much takes the idea that everything should be compiled to ZVM. So if you want to do some cryptography, compile your cryptography to ZVM. If you want to do verify a combinatorial batch auction, compile that to ZVM and verify it. And it's pretty elegant to do this way, but it's pretty inefficient. It's really hard to get things, complicated things working. In Tezos, you have the point of view that, hey, let's change the protocol if we need to. You have a pretty straightforward path for doing that, and so things like verifying cryptographic primitive, or maybe verifying combinatorial things, any type of like large primitives that you might need, you can actually put at the protocol level, which may be more efficient than trying to compile that into a VM.
Yeah, so what types of things do these kind of more native style entities that don't need to be hosted in a certain way play for DeFi? Like what constructions sort of could you make? Do you envision that private versions of the DeFi protocols are more efficient in Tezos? Maybe walk us through some of those types of like more futuristic things.
Oh, geez. I mean, I think then the bigger question here is like what type of applications in DeFi are interesting. If you're looking at the type of constraints, the answer is pretty boring in the sense of like, token contracts or Uniswap style contracts. You could move those at the protocol level and get like really low gas limits on them, for example. There's also a lot of tricks that people are trying with Uniswap, for example, to batch transaction until the end of the block if you have multiple transactions in a block, and that requires some trickery. If you just do it at the protocol level, you don't need to bother with all the complexity. So that's definitely one thing you can do. But if you're looking at the applications, like I was saying, a lot of it is circular. Like a lot of the DeFi ecosystem today that exists because there's a lot of tokens which frankly don't have a big reason to exist. Their only reason to exist is to be pretty much traded against one another. And so it means that people want leverage, and so there's lending, and people want DEXs. And so all of this, DEX ecosystem and lending ecosystem exists kind of like for circular reason and not actually providing financial services. The things that do, the most promising decentralized financial services that may exist, I think stablecoin are potentially interesting. But again, I think the interest from stablecoin is driven by the interest from leverage and not so much for the stablecoin themselves. And I'm talking about like maker style stablecoin and not the not the tokenized bank account type of stablecoin. And prediction markets, I think that those are moving prediction market at the protocol level in Tezos is one thing that I often mentioned in the past as the type of application that you might want to quote unquote nationalize at the protocol level for efficiency and for creating shelling points.
Maybe if we take another view on kind of DeFi on Tezos, Tezos is a proof of stake network like Ethereum 2, like Cosmos, like a lot of the other networks that probably don't need to be named because most of them aren't live.
Including Ethereum 2.
Right. Well, that's fair. But I think an interesting question though is, do you actually think sort of POS and DeFi can really coexist? They have very similar properties. A lot of the derivative assets that exist can interact with each other. Recently has been showed by myself and some co-authors that like staking derivatives and proof of stake have very equivalent payoff structures to a lot of DeFi protocols like synthetics. And so these things can actually be deleterious to the layer one security, but they can also help promote equality amongst validators. So how do you view this kind of interaction of building an ecosystem of these DeFi protocols while also making sure it does keep the layer one protocol safe and usable and censorship resistant?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to a paper where you look at whether any form of yield, maybe through lending or through participating in some DeFi protocol, may compete with block reward in a proof of stake system and drops the security of the system. And I think any decent proof of stake chain needs to be able to adjust to adjust its own rewards based on the staking. And there's basically two ways to do that. The way that it's done in Tezos works, but it's pretty crude. Basically, what you do is that you set a very high reward for the block producer, and then they basically contract out of off-band out of the chain with people who delegate to them, and they return and they return some of that. So today, if you look at Tezos bakers, for example, they stake about 10% of what's delegated to them. The block reward is going to be about around like 5% a year on what's delegated to them, and then they probably return about 90% of that to the people who delegate to them. And this 90% is basically it's a threshold. It's something that can be moved. So in some sense, if it becomes less profitable for bakers to create blocks and secure the ledger, they can lower that amount, and that gives you flexibility. The other approach is I don't know how they're doing it now, but certainly at some point, the way that Polkadot was looking to do this is fix an amount of stake that must be had. Say, we want 40% staked, and then auction out the stake to the block reward. Gets how many, what block reward do we need to offer to get 40% of the stake to be staked, and then clear that. So that, which is equivalent to the other model, although a little more explicit.
Sure. Although running auctions on the blockchain is not a fun exercise, I will say. So I think the thing I was actually referring to is really staking derivatives, which I know you have vocally been quite negative about, but I guess we don't have too much time, so I want to end on a question related to something that I believe was quite prominent the first time I met you, which was with prediction markets and futarchy. How do you believe the Oracle problem within DeFi will be kind of settled? What do you think the final solution is? Is it truly that Chainlink has won and the world is over? Is it more that there's this open Oracle model compound? Is it the Uniswap model? Or is it the extremely capital intensive and terrible UX model of ARC? Or none of the above?
There's these sentences that you can always say, and you'll be right and you'll be smart. And so one of these is, it depends on your threat model, but it's true. And I like to think of it as a graph, and on one hand, you like, how much complexity do you have in your system, and the other one is like, how much security do you have in a system. And once you have, like one solution, and whether it is for being an oracle, for example, or being a bridge between chains, once one solution is you have a federation. You have like 8 out of 15 participants or some amount, and they're known and they're public, and that's very, very simple. And in most use cases, you do not need anything else. Like in most cases, this is absolutely fine, and the complexity is very low. And you want to, and as soon as you want to go beyond that, the complexity gets fiendishly hard. And so if you want to go beyond that, you really, really ought to have a very, very strong reason to do that. I think that for the most decentralized stable coins, you might want to do that for price feeds, for example. But even then, it's too easy to get focused on the problem of like, oh, what if what if the members cheat? What if they don't report the right number? There are so many other things that could go wrong. So like, the feed that they read from, that feed could be modified, and that's a problem. Like the raw data that you're collecting itself might be manipulated. You also have the fact that I think if you have like large known entities participating, the risk is far greater than they actually just decide that they don't want to be an oracle anymore, or they're forced not to be an oracle anymore, rather than actually like outright lying. And no, that I think you have to be smart about the threat model before jumping into like crazy crypto-economic design, no matter how fun that is.
I agree. I mean, that's certainly the lesson of 2017 is people need to have maybe tried implementing it before, funding it. But I think, some of the other conversations earlier today talked about how like alternative sources of liquidity seem to be ample once you've proven that your mechanism can work. And I think that seems to be quite a viable way to bootstrap these ecosystems.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with that is related to something that I haven't said? Maybe like your view on the DeFi space in the next year.
I mean, my view is basically I really hope that it evolves. I think it's really interesting. I think it definitely has product market fit in the sense of like I think it competes with some of the coin exchanges that have spun out, and so it does have product market fit in the sense that these are the businesses around the space which have been really successful. I hope it goes beyond that. I hope it starts like serving needs which aren't served otherwise, and which go beyond like what I would call entertainment, and that would be things like prediction market, for example, things like insurance. I think these are real use cases which are underserved in many areas, and I'd like to see more of those in DeFi. Thank you.